Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Mindfulness, Envy, and Relationships in the Workplace. I'm Dr. Geoff Soloway. I'm the founder and Chief Training Officer at MindWell-U. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. It's a very exciting topic, and we're really looking forward to our special guest, Dr. Chris Bell, who's going to be sharing the research that he does in this area. Before we get going, I'm going to just go through a few logistics for you. Firstly, we're going to invite you to ask questions throughout the webinar, and you can do that in your chat window. So if you have a question that you'd like to post, we're going to make it as interactive as possible. I'll try and ask that question throughout the webinar, or if it's best kept towards the end, I'll save it towards the end. We're also going to have some poll questions that we ask of people. So, for example, you might see a poll question show up like this. Have you ever taken part in the 30-day mindfulness challenge? So you're welcome to answer the poll question. I noticed that there was a lot of people signed up for this webinar who are part of our clients. So thank you and welcome. Welcome to you all. So MindWell-U offers evidence-based online and in-person trainings for organizations across Canada and into the US. So a lot of people have taken our training. I see that so far there's also 40% of you haven't. So if you haven't taken the 30-day mindfulness challenge, you're going to get a link following this webinar where you'll be able to sign up and take the online training, if that's of interest to you. So the second thing I wanted to let you know is that we are going to be following up from this webinar with an email in the coming days, and that will provide you with a recording of it in case you have to leave early or in case you think it's a great webinar and you want to share it with a colleague. So we're going to send you that as well. So you can expect that in the coming days. So the goal of one last thing is we're really excited to have this topic of mindfulness and envy and relationships in the workplace. We see it as part of our mission of MindWell, of helping to cultivate mindful organizations. And we're really delighted to have an expert in this field, Dr. Chris Bell. He's a professor from the Schulich School of Business at York University, and also someone that I've had the fortune of collaborating with over the past few months as we are developing a new research project in this area. So welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeff. Pleasure to be here.
I'd like to just jump right into it and let you actually give a little bit more context about your research and the work that you've been doing in this area.
Sure. Most of my research is in the area of organizational behavior. And I've done a lot of work on perceptions of fairness and justice in the workplace. But when I started doing my research as a PhD and up until today also, I've had a real interest in emotions, and in particular, social self-conscious or moral emotions. I've looked at shame and guilt and also envy in the workplace as they relate to justice or fairness perceptions, and fairness experiences. And done some work with colleagues around the world in China, Pakistan, UK, Europe, and we're comparing our results in different cultures, which has been very interesting.
Yeah, that is fascinating. So no doubt you'll integrate some of that insight into the conversation today about how it compares to other cultures around the world. That'll be interesting. Let's just start off with the basics. Basics for you, but probably new for a lot of us who are watching and discussing envy for the first time. What is envy, and how does it impact our relationships in the workplace?
Envy is it's an interesting emotion because when people do research in emotions, they look at what function that it has, what value it might have in terms of our behavior or performance or relationships with other people. And envy, it's a real challenge to say that there's a positive value to envy a lot of times. But it comes from a social comparison that we might do with other people. And these social comparisons are really part of who we are. They're almost hardwired in us. We are very social beings, and we come from a long line of social beings where an organization around the different people within the group is really important. So we compare ourselves to each other, first to see how other people are behaving. So how do we fit in? And part of that comparison is often not just seeing who we might learn from, but how we might change our behavior to be like others, or to be working towards goals that other people share. So there's a kind of a personal evaluation and correction involved with that social comparison. And we also do often upward social comparisons, because there's a lot of value to seeing how people who are respected and who have a lot of status within a social group, how they behave and how they perform. So we can learn from that. And we also are intrinsically interested in what the ranking is within a social group and where we stand. So from those perspectives, as social beings, we naturally make these kinds of comparisons and perceptions of ourselves and others within the group. And that can help us integrate into the group and be good group members, if you will. But on the downside of it, there are possible emotional responses. On the one hand, if we look at somebody who performs better than us, we can admire them and we can try to be like them, use them as a role model. But at the same time, there's a feeling of difference, of course. There's a comparison gap. And sometimes this feeling of inferiority can give rise to envy. And envy itself can have some positive effects, but it also can have some negative effects.
And you're a professor in the business school at York University. How is it received? How do you find it fitting within this context of the workplace at the business school?
Well, envy is really important as a subject. I mean, of course, I think so, but the emotions within the workplace have become more of a focus because they relate to things like how do we connect with other people? How do we connect with the organization? How do we not just connect with people, but work with them in different ways? And also personal well-being. I think the Europeans have been ahead of us in terms of looking at organizational well-being and personal well-being. But in North America, we're starting to catch up on that. The envy part of it is also of course, related to well-being, but also to performance very strongly. There's lots of evidence, for instance, that when people feel a really negative form of envy, that they then want to, they're motivated to avoid that social comparison again. So they may make vague goals instead of more specific goals. So it can really affect performance. There was a really interesting study done on bicyclists who, racers, and people who felt stronger envy set vaguer goals, and then their performance was impacted by having vague instead of specific targets. So there's that effect, for instance, that's important not just for the individuals, but for other people that we're working with. And of course, there's a motivation to close the comparison gap. And sometimes that can be done through less positive methods, such as trying to bring the other person down. So social undermining or sabotage sometimes. Maybe not in a direct way, but not working or supporting another coworker, things like that.
Okay. And we just asked the poll question to our audience, and we said, how have you ever felt envious of a colleague's success, either material outcomes or recognition and praise? And we had 75% said yes, 25% said no.
Well, personally, I wish I was in the 25%. But I mean, I have colleagues who are very optimistic all the time and take a very positive view to that. I think it's natural at some point, especially if we're really if the goals are really important to us. Often there aren't a lot of outcomes that, like for instance, a promotion to a particular position or things like that. There may not be enough to go around for everybody. So it's not unusual to feel envious of other people. The question is, what does it do to us, right? How much pain we might feel from that? How much ourselves are implicated in that comparison. So if I compare myself to somebody and I really want that outcome, and that person, I see that person as being similar to me, so I can think about myself in that position, I'm more likely to feel envious. There was a really interesting study done on comparing gold medalists to silver medalists and bronze medalists. And the silver medalists tended to appear to experience greater envy because they were looking up the podium thinking that could be me. The bronze medalists tended not to show themselves to be looking like they were feeling envy. And the argument is that they were looking down at the people who were not on the podium and saying, at least I am here on the podium in some way. But it's an interesting question because the implication is that the people who are most likely to feel envy are actually high performers. I'm not saying that the people who didn't feel envy are not also high performers. People who are very competitive or have a different perspective on achievements may not feel envy, and they just go back, think about how they might improve their performance and then move forward or change goals. But the likelihood is that most of us at some time are going to feel at least a twinge of envy towards somebody else who got something that we wanted too.
Right. So it's a normal emotion, and we don't hear too much conversation about envy. I would say in our workplace or just in conversations. And I'm curious about that. And I'm also wondering, how do you think that we experience envy in ourselves and others?
Right. Envy, I think, it's a stigmatized emotion. It's hard to admit to others because, on the one hand, it's an admission that I don't feel I've done as well as this other person, and I feel bad about that. So it's an admission of feeling somewhat inferior or not as good as other people. And of course, we don't want to do that. It's an uncomfortable thing to talk about. Then there's also, the idea that it's in some ways it's a moral emotion. Almost every culture has talked about envy as a socially disruptive emotion and something that we should not feel. Which is unfortunate because it's really a common experience, and it makes it harder to then talk about. One of the things that we're seeing, especially at my school with the students, is that it's a very competitive environment, and people often do feel badly when they don't perform at a certain level, and so being able to talk about that actually diffuses some of that self-reflection and feelings of being inferior.
Right, and that's maybe that's where the mindfulness piece might connect in with how mindfulness and envy are related. And I know we're gonna get there. We just asked another poll question, and I think it just reflects what you were just speaking to. How likely are people to tell a colleague that they envy somebody at work? And close to maybe that's 70% are unlikely. So unlikely to talk about it, and still maybe.
I have to say, this is the first time we've asked this question, so I'm really interested in these results. I mean, it suggests that people really suffer in silence about this, because it can be a very painful experience, and it's an emotion that like I said, it's been stigmatized in most cultures, but at the same time, if we're feeling envy towards someone who's similar to us, sometimes that person is actually a close friend or a close colleague, someone we feel very positively about. And our evidence is that these kinds of comparisons and feelings of envy are the most, in a sense, traumatic to the person. They're very difficult to deal with because people feel very conflicted. It goes beyond competition to really, and sometimes, wanting to change that person's success in ways that are not positive.
Do you feel that there's a lot of awareness? People have a lot of self-awareness that they're experiencing envy?
I think that's also a really interesting question, just in terms of awareness. Sometimes when I talk to administrators and talk about the research, and I start out saying I'm studying envy, the first response I get is something along the lines of, I'm in favor of competition. So there's this idea that, and then I tell the story about the Olympic medalists, and I catch their attention, because it's really, it is really more often the high performers or people who think that they could have, see themselves in the same position, see themselves as achieving those outcomes. Those are the people who are often likely to feel envy. But socially, I don't think that we think that way. I think we stigmatize the experience of envy, which makes it hard to talk about. But from an individual perspective, when we feel envy, we feel, it makes us feel bad. It's associated with feeling bad about ourselves, about our abilities. And then when we don't share that with other people, we tend to ruminate on it. And envy itself is often associated with these defensive kinds of reactions, like thinking that it's unfair that somebody else got something, and it could very well have been unfair that they got something. But, we often have these responses where if it feels unfair. So there's other things that we tend to do that are self-defensive tactics that can be distracting.
I kind of want to bring this back, and we've gone into this a little bit already, but talking more about the costs and opportunities of envy in the workplace. So it really is really clear for people, and we have a lot of different people on the call today. Both people are in an organization, some people are managing others, leading others, working on the front lines. What can you tell us more about the costs and opportunities of envy in the workplace?
Well, there's been a fair bit of research. I mean, the research has tended to focus on the negative effects of envy, which I think is, it's a good idea to do that. But we're starting to move towards a more balanced approach, especially with this idea that it's very likely that the people who are feeling envy and having negative reactions are people whose performance we really want to preserve, we want to maintain, and we want to promote. So there are costs just in the initial reaction to people's feelings of envy. But then, especially this idea that we don't talk about it. So then how does that affect our interactions with people? And how does that then affect the performance of the work group, but also our own performance? And the likelihood is that we draw back. We start to not support other people and not get support for ourselves. And that can have negative effects on performance. There's been a lot of work done on things like sabotage, or when people feel envy, they also feel angry and they lash out. They may be very angry at the organization for an outcome that they see as unfair, and that has implications. So there's been quite a bit of research. Most of the research to date has been looking at these kinds of negative effects of trying to close the comparison gap, but usually by bringing the other person's performance down. There's also been work on this idea of trying to avoid the social comparison again. And on the negative side, that can be, as I mentioned before, not setting clear goals, which is important in terms of, targeting and directing our performance. But it can also have other effects, through an avoidance of performance. On the bright side, what we found is that if people feel that there is an opportunity to perform, if they can get I was going to use a popular term these days, a recount, but if people feel that they can reset that comparison in some way and continue to perform well and then bring up their performance, or at least become more even with the other party, then that has a positive effect.
Right, and that what you just said, I think, is reflected in our latest poll question: does feeling envious make you want to get closer to people or avoid people? And we had 80% of people marking avoid people.
Yeah, sorry, but to me that's a really very, very interesting response, because when we think of the kind of thoughts that are associated with envy, which are often very, very negative and negative towards oneself, and then the motivations that come from envy, the idea that we're pulling back from others and avoiding others is really associated with a hit to self-esteem, right? We even if it's not so, sometimes when we don't get that outcome, we think that other people see that as us having a loss of status, and so it affects our self-esteem. We pull back from people. We don't want to share with people. All of these things can really exacerbate the experience and the problem. And oftentimes, people, because it's stigmatized, I don't want to keep beating that drum, but because it's stigmatized, it's hard to share those feelings, even though they're very painful. It's hard to say, like, I'm feeling envious, this is how it makes me feel. It can be hard to really share that.
So I want to just take a moment to invite our guests who are on the webinar. If they have any questions arising or comments arising, feel free to put it into the chat window, see if we can integrate it into the conversation. It's been really interesting to get a really firm foundation and understanding more about envy. I want to ask you, Chris, one more question before looking at the connection between mindfulness, and you've already started to speak about it, but I'd like you to, again, go over the clear distinctions between this notion of malicious and benign envy.
But it's a really interesting distinction that's really starting to get more clarity in the research literature now. Although in different cultures, usually collectivist cultures, there is even a linguistic distinction between malicious envies, which is what we tend to consider to be the more traditional form of envy, the kind of negative envy where it's associated with closing the comparison gap by bringing the other person down. And a kind of benign envy that's also different from admiration, but similar in the sense that people still feel pain of the social comparison, but their motivation is to close the comparison gap by improving their performance. So in fact, with benign envy, people will be more likely to watch the person that they envy and try to learn from them, for instance. There's a motivation to overcome the kind of obstacles that might be in place. So there's more persistence in a task and things like that, which is positive, and it tends to be more constructive in that sense. It does also tend to focus the person in on the specific task where they compare themselves with the other person. But it leaves them also open to other opportunities to perform or to gain some form of status.
So we got lots. Thank you, Chris. We got lots of questions coming in now that I wanna get to. I think you're looking at the poll question. Do you try and learn from the person you envy? So 53% saying sometimes.
I mean, there's a reluctance there, but people say most times too. There's an interesting temporal progression. So I find one of the things that really helps sometimes is just going up and saying congratulations to the person. Because it's a positive gesture, and that it doesn't put me in a situation where I'm going to continue to sort of brood on things. But at some point, and it could take some time after the whatever the outcome was where we made the comparison, we see that the person is succeeding in some way, and we want to learn what they're doing. We may not want to do everything that the person does, but there's value in that. But it's interesting that it's not a very strong motivation to learn from other parties.
So we've got, thank you, Chris. We've got a lot of questions here, and you know, I'll try and get through them in a skillful way that makes sense. I'm going to start with one that was kind of my next question that I was going to ask you, which is around, is there been any research on envy with more senior staff of those under them? So starting to talk about, you know,
Yes,
leaders. And we
yeah.
talked about that at one point.
Yeah, it's interesting. There is actually some research done on senior staff who envy a star performer who's rising. There are, I guess you could say, strategic reasons why a senior staff may want to keep a star performer within his or her work group. But then in terms of abusive supervision, for instance, there has been some evidence that senior staff who envy a junior staff who's a rising star or who's a high performer may see that as may envy that person, and then actually can take actions to thwart that person's performance.
So there's lots of different relationships in which one can feel envy, both looking up and looking down.
It's an interesting question because the classic literature has always talked about making an upward social comparison, but in fact, making a social comparison at all tends to trigger all these different types of social comparisons. But up and down the organizational rank system is an interesting question because that is involved with perceptions of the person's performance now compared to the manager's performance. So that can be very threatening. If the manager or the supervisor or the person in the more senior position sees the other person as actually performing better than them and having greater potential, which are kind of two different things, because the greater potential is really a future-oriented view, so that the person may develop into a better performer than the senior staff is now, which is interesting because it gets into these kinds of questions about seeing ourselves in the present and seeing ourselves in the future.
Chris, you're talking a lot about social comparison. Don't we live in a world full of social comparison, like social media? Is this not breeding this type of emotion in us?
Well, there's research done, and which has been in the news also on Facebook and social comparisons that people make on social media, and the representations that people construct of themselves on social media, and whether those are realistic and things like that. But the more fundamental issue is that we're really hardwired to make these kinds of social comparisons. The interesting question is how perhaps social media then exploits that in some way, and really kind of puts gasoline on the fire, so to speak. So I don't think it's something we can possibly stop doing. I don't think it's productive to stop doing, because when we join a group, we are concerned about how others think of us, and we do look at how others behave and perform in order to really adjust towards that. So that in itself is a very natural thing to do. It's a very social thing to do. When it starts to become painful for us to do it, then that starts to bring up the questions of how do we manage the social comparison?
Right, and we're getting a lot of questions about the next step into what do we do about it. But before I want to ask one last question. I'm going to ask the audience just for a little bit of one more moment of patience before we move into that step of what do we do about it, because we've got one question that I think is still in this previous conversation. It's, do you see age or generational differences in the workplace in envy? As in like classical millennial blaming boomer praising mentality. So do you see a difference in the generations and how they experience envy? Has there been any research to look at that?
It's a really great question. And there has not been, to my knowledge, an exploration of how envy is experienced or expressed in different generations. That's a really interesting question. Thank you. I'll start looking at it.
Yeah. So we'll make a note of that question, and maybe we'll look at that in our upcoming research study, and we'll maybe speak to that in a moment. Okay, I think it's time that we need to take that step to learning about what do we do about it. And my next question I'm going to ask you, Chris, is what's the relationship here with mindfulness? And before we get there, I'm going to just invite everyone in the audience, and if you've taken the mindfulness challenge, then you know what Take 5 is. Take 5 is our mindfulness in action practice. It's an opportunity to take a break, a meaningful break in your life, and one that you don't actually have to stop what you're doing, but you can reground, come into the present moment while you're watching a webinar. And so I invite everyone to just feel their feet on the floor and to reconnect with their sense of their body, their chair, maybe their felt sense of the body sitting, lifting and lengthening up through the spine. Maybe they notice the breath moving into the body, maybe the belly moving in, the belly moving out, the chest rising and falling. Seeing if you can just pay attention to one complete breath moving into the body and moving out. And as we're turning inwards, we can just tune into what emotions are present in the body, thoughts that might be going through our mind, and just seeing if we can greet whatever is present with a sense of acceptance, of non-judgment. Breathe with it for a few moments, perhaps. And stay connected with our breath and our body as we continue to explore this fascinating topic of envy. And Chris, how do we transform envy with mindfulness?
Well, one of the precursors of envy is the feeling of pain from the social comparison. And the mindfulness practices clearly are excellent ways of managing that phenomenon, that process, and then also the recollection of those that bring to mind things that make us feel envious. I like what you were talking about during the Take 5 in terms of being very centered and in the moment. Oftentimes our mind will start racing towards the implications of something and what it might mean in terms of other future situations, or how we think people might think of us. So staying centered and grounded, I think is a really important way of looking objectively at the situation.
We call that thought trains, Chris, on the training. We call it thought trains, and we teach ourselves how to notice these trains of thoughts that are going on in our head, and how we can just stay at the train station and watch them go by. Sometimes those trains of thoughts take us to places that aren't helpful. And so if we don't get on the train, we don't go to that destination. Right.
Yeah, and I think that's important because oftentimes, even if something is really important to us and how we think, often because of what we think this means in terms of how others see us or judge us or evaluate us, it's often not the case. I mean, or at least not as strongly as we think it is. So in that sense, I think it's really important to maintain a focus on the current situation. The self-acceptance, of course, is really important. Being able to say, I didn't get this time, but I did well, and I can continue to do well in the next round. I could come up better. So we're just, especially with the sense that the social comparison can make us feel bad about ourselves and that we aren't achieving the things we want to. This idea of being non-judgmental and self-accepting, I think, is really important. And that stops it from moving into the more negative form of envy. We may still feel some pain. We're not, going to be numb, but, at least it stops the development into the more negative form of envy, the more malicious and aggressive form of envy, and into a more motivating form of envy, where really what we want is to get the similar outcomes as the other person.
So what I'm hearing you say, Chris, is that becoming aware of this emotion, which is, we become aware of it in the body, and the qualities of it. And if we can learn to be with it, bring this more acceptance to it, a bit of self-compassion to it, knowing that it's a normal human emotion,
Right.
that we can help to work with it in a more skillful way and start to transform it from more this malicious form of envy into more of a benign form of envy.
Yeah, if we're more aware of those processes, then we can gain more control over the emotion rather than the emotion controlling us. If we're not aware, then it's really easy to be driven by some of these emotional states.
So here are a couple practical questions here, and I think we were just talking about it, but I'm curious to hear what comes to mind for you when you read it. When envious, for example, I did not get the promotion and I'm envious of the person who did, how should I handle that?
Well, it's hard to put a real, it's a really important question. It's hard to give one answer that fits all situations. I find, congratulating the person can be really helpful. It's a gesture, not only to the person, but to oneself that this is acceptable. And continuing to work towards, towards the things that you feel make you happy about your own performance and skills and abilities is always important. It's the tricky thing often is that when the other person gets the promotion, it may be a long time before another promotion becomes available. And so it feels like this is all or nothing, but really there are other opportunities usually and other things one can do in terms of just the short term and the other people in the workplace and things like that. Earlier in the question about whether you avoid people or not, a lot of people said that they did avoid people, and I think that that's something that we want to really have a practice to turn around, in part because it's not the case that people look at the person who did get the promotion and the person who did not get the promotion and then make an assessment that's anywhere near as strong as the assessment we make of ourselves. So people are actually, they're quite understanding. They know that you tried for it, you wanted it, and they're very accepting of it. It often doesn't change their view of you or your abilities. And next time around, maybe you can do better and get that outcome.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. I've got another question here, which is, I think, coming at it from a little bit of a different perspective or a different angle of envy. And it's, I'd like to know how one can react mindfully to what they call sabotage if you see that somebody is backbiting on you because of feelings of envy. So if I read that, I think what the person's asking is, if somebody's feeling envious towards you, what can you do about that?
Yeah, it's a really difficult situation. I mean, a lot of times people who even if they feel that other people within a group that they care about, are going to be feeling badly because they're outperforming them, people will handicap themselves and perform not according to their actual abilities and skills. So part of that question is, how do we maintain our normal or preferred performance and behavior and interactions with others when we've got this situation going on? The backbiting, sorry, I've got a bird nesting up here, just knocking on my roof. The backbiting can be a real problem because this issue of maintaining positive relationships with people in the workplace, it's a political situation in many senses, and we want to be positive about it and hope that perhaps that this might pass with time. If it starts to become a really truly political situation, then it's a different case. But just in terms of how how one should react to that. I think it's challenging in the sense that we want to be careful that we're not then feeding into it by responding to it in a sense. Sometimes my feeling is the best response is just to take the higher road, as Michelle Obama said, so, and not engage with it.
So there's a mindfulness practice there as well about responding with compassion as well.
Right. And I think that can be important because really, the person who's doing that may not be doing that out of a really truly malicious intent. They're just very internally focused. They're feeling hurt and they're feeling threatened, and they're reacting because of that. So if we can reach out to them. I had a student actually who was very sensitive to the idea. He was a really high performer, and we've done some work actually on the envy and social comparison stuff, and he's now a consultant. And one of the things that he has done in his life is to mix his own performance with mentoring. So he, leaves himself open to others and reaches out to them to help them do better. So that's helpful. It also doesn't make the person feel so isolated.
Okay. Well, I've got another question that I know a lot of people on the call will probably be interested in. And what are some suggestions for steps that organizations can take to minimize the possibility of malicious envy?
One important thing that we found is the idea that there are other opportunities, right? So that the person is going to be able to improve their performance at some point. Even in the short term, that's really important because it sort of diffuses the idea that this is an all or nothing outcome. So opportunities for training, the kinds of things that people can make use of. That can be really important. So those are really critical. Being conscious that people are going to react in ways, and we find this in organizations or teams where people just talk about competition and assume that everybody should accept that, and if they don't, then somehow, that's really them. But the fact is, people will be invested in these things and emotionally invested in these things. And so being able to, manage that and those expectations that people have and their ability to feel that they have the control and power over their situation, that they can correct that they can perform better. We found that actually shifts people from malicious envy to benign. We've got evidence of that.
And from an organizational level, let's say there's people out there who are looking at it from an HR level and thinking about this is something that might lead to conflict in the workplace or lower productivity. Have you seen some things that organizations are doing in terms of practices, policies, trainings that are looking to address, at least in part, this conversation around envy?
Like I said before, a lot of the work that's been done historically has been on the idea that has been, first of all, framed on the idea that it's been about protecting the high performer, which I think, frankly, probably exacerbates the situation. So one of the things that we're trying to do is bring more attention to the fact that the people who are feeling envy are actually high performers themselves, and if we lose them, we lose a lot of quality and a lot of value in the organization. So that's something that we hope that people will start to develop more practices, not just in HR, but also in terms of supervisor and manager training. Because it's really, it's not just the HR, it's the people that we interact with every day on a day-to-day basis that can make a real difference.
That's really interesting. And maybe we can even just take a moment to frame this upcoming research study that we're doing, we're collaborating on. And could you share a little bit about the intent behind that and how that's being set up and what you hope to gain insight into?
Sure. So one of the things that, like I said, one of the things that we're really trying to do is take a better look at how people are able to maintain their performance and their ambitions and goals after some kind of experience that might make them feel envious. So we're doing that through the mindfulness practices, and we're trying to see how the mindfulness practices at the event of the social comparison might reduce the social pain and thereby prevent benign envy from growing into malicious envy. Because the difference between the two is really based on how much social pain the person feels at the point of comparison. What's interesting, though, is that over time, after the comparison, the memory of the comparison and the social pain about the comparison separates from the envy. So if we recall that situation, or if we see that person again, or if we think about that difference between us, we'll feel painful and we'll feel envious, but these are no longer connected in the same way. So mindfulness at that point, it will be more about the emotional awareness and emotional self-regulation. That will be about managing the emotion rather than the kind of preventing the emotion from building up and then establishing itself almost as an emotional attitude about the event and the other person. So we're looking at those two in the sense of an event that really carries over time, that we carry with us over time.
And also looking at how it compares to behaviors in the workplace around incivility.
Right. So, and again, the traditional focus has been on this idea of that the malicious envy will be expressed through different kinds of behaviors that are either anger-based behaviors and lashing out, or the idea of trying to close the comparison gap between oneself and the other party. It's often hard to do that because of the way the workplace is structured and organized. So we may not actually be always able to affect another person's performance. And oftentimes, because the others, we don't want to, it's a covert behavior. So there would be, backbiting like the participant mentioned before, and these kinds of more sort of subtle grousing behaviors and incivilities. So what we're hoping is that we can lessen the social pain and the malicious envy that would both then lead to these kinds of low level, but really, as your participant said, we can feel really affected by these kinds of things where people are saying bad things about us, and it feels not only personally like a personal assault, but it starts to then assault what we see as our social network and our network of friends and social support. So those kinds of incivilities are not trivial. They can build into a really impactful situation that affects a number of people. So what we're hoping is through the mindfulness training, we'll be able to reduce those kinds of behaviors and motivations from individuals, but then also that has an effect on the work group itself, that there's going to be more positive interactions and behaviors between people, and supportive behaviors possibly. Learning in some senses is a supportive behavior. If someone comes to me and wants to learn something from me, that's a supportive behavior in the sense that I want to help the person, and that supports them, but then also it makes me feel good about what I learned and motivated to learn more and do better. So we're hoping we'll get this sort of iterative effect.
Right, individual and group effect. When you were speaking, one other kind of mechanism came to mind earlier when you mentioned when people are feeling this malicious form of envy, they're really self-focused. And in the mindfulness literature, there's a big focus. There's a lot of research talking about the self and identification with the self and this experiential self versus the narrative self, or when we're caught up in our small self, ego self, versus when we're kind of more in our broader notion of self that sees others. And so with mindfulness, what it tends to do is it brings us out of ourselves, and so that we can see more of our interrelationships. And if we're not so narrowly self-focused, we won't potentially get caught up in envy as much. And we see this within the clinical psychology work around reperceiving or decentering, pulling people outside of themselves.
Right. Well, I mean, the self is essentially social anyways. So, you know, once we start to disconnect from other people, we lose out on a feedback loop that can be very positive and very supportive. But we also lose connection with others. We lose this idea we get a much more narrow sense of who we are and who we are in relationship to other people.
So a couple more questions here. We're coming to close to the end here, but anything come to mind here, Chris? Can you recommend any strategies to cope with envy and adapt to the situation?
Well, I think the mindfulness training, and we're hoping to find the evidence of this from the research that we've got coming up. But the mindfulness training seems really very, very promising. Between the self-acceptance, the objective awareness, and the the emotional self-regulation, it really looks very, very promising. In terms of other kinds of practical ways of dealing with it, I would suggest really also thinking about that there are other opportunities, that this wasn't the only outcome that's important. There are many ways to get to the kinds of goals we have in life. And I found it interesting, the comment you made earlier about how it starts to really narrow us in on a very narrow definition of self and a very narrow definition of our place in the world and the things that we're engaged in. One of the ideas of this broader view includes this idea that there are many ways that we can approach different kinds of goals or approach our life goals in general.
Thank you. Kind of one other question that's come up. Do people who are envious overestimate their abilities to perform at that level, or are they accurately envious?
I think that's an excellent question. I kind of thought somebody would come up with that at some point. I think one of the things is also the distinction between really, 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 really wanting that outcome and making a judgment that one is actually deserving of that outcome, objectively deserving of that outcome, in the sense that one's performance is actually at that level. And that's a really important question. I think that there's certainly, I don't want to get into the question we had earlier about generational differences, but there's really a question about how accurately we're able to assess our own performance. One of the important things about reacting to these social comparisons is being able to really do a kind of error check, right? Like, first of all, assess our own abilities and skills, and then find out where it is that we might be able to learn. My student that I spoke of earlier, who's now also my colleague, one of the things that he does in his consulting is he helps people write their cover letters when they're looking for new jobs. And he said it's the hardest thing to do is to get people to objectively self-reflect on their skills and abilities. It can be very, very difficult to do, but it's a really important process. I know that I went a little further away from the question the person asked, but to put it in sort of a short form, I think we often overestimate our skills and abilities, and that's an important thing to be aware of.
Maybe one final question, Chris, which is again a different perspective. I think you've spoken to it a little bit already. Could you suggest how to deal with management that is angry and demanding of work to be done when you are performing to the best of your ability? How to have respect for this manager despite this behavior? So dealing with feeling envious of their job. Does that make sense?
That's a complicated question. I have to think about that for a minute.
I could
it's, right?
go ahead if you have something, but we can always move on if it.
But it's to give us an answer to that specific question, I think I need more background information. But if I can speculate, it sounds like there's a manager who's over demanding of what he or she is able to realistically ask of his or her employees. The envious part, I think, is more the idea that the person would prefer not to be subject to that manager and is hoping to one day be promoted to a situation where they're not under what sounds like an abusive situation.
Right.
So that's an interesting question. It's the envy part of it is not what I would traditionally call envy, although it is wanting the similar things that the other person wants. But it sounds like a situation where the worker, the employee is not being respected for the work that they're doing. It's not being properly recognized. So it's involved with these similar kinds of things in terms of being evaluated or assessed in some way, but not objectively evaluated, not appropriately evaluated. And that's, demeaning. And
Yeah, no, thank you, Chris. I'm seeing that we're just in our final few moments, so I'm going to hear my bell ring behind me in just a moment to let me know. But I'm going to take a moment to just wrap things up, Chris, and then I'm going to give you the last word if there's something you want to share. Before I do that, I just want to share one comment from a participant saying that the session was fantastic. It really got me thinking about the message that an organization unconsciously sends that may contribute to negative outcomes, and how we can reframe those messages so that employees don't feel inferior just because they didn't get the promotion they wanted. Here's my mindful bell. We don't want to lose high performance. We need to take the stigma out of envy and start talking about it more hopefully. And she hopes to get the ball rolling in her organization. Thank you for all of your questions and comments today. It's been a very engaged audience, and we really appreciate that. And before we sign off, I want to remind you about a couple of quick things. One is, in the coming days, you're going to receive an email from us with a link to be able to see a recording of this. If you think it would be valuable to share it with somebody in your organization, please do that. If you haven't taken the 30-day mindfulness challenge, we encourage you to do that as well. If your organization has registered for it, then you can access that for free through your organization. If not, there's going to be a link that we'll be providing to you where you can get a discounted rate to take the mindfulness challenge. And finally, we want to just let you know about an upcoming webinar that we have December 5th with Dr. Kristen Wilson. Really excited about that webinar as well. She's going to be talking about attention, learning, and mindfulness in a digital world, a cognitive psychology perspective. So we're really excited about that upcoming session. So if that interests you, welcome you to register for that one as well. Once again, thank you to everyone who signed on today and for all your contributions, and a big thank you, of course, to Dr. Chris Bell for sharing his time and his wisdom with us. Really excited about an upcoming research study we're doing within the Government of Canada, exploring envy and mindfulness. Chris, any last thought you want to share with our group today?
Well, thank you, Geoff, and thank you everyone for participating. I really enjoyed the questions, and I learned a lot from the poll responses and from your experiences also. So I really appreciate that. As a final kind of word, I would just say that one of the things we want to bear in mind is that we think that these situations often are very meaningful to people around us and how they see us, but they're often not as important to other people as they seem to be to us. So I hope with some of these mindfulness practices, we can all feel better.
Thank you. Some wise words to close us off. Thanks so much, Chris. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.